Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got notes for Chapter 20, Section 1, the beginning of the French Revolution. So, as we go along, make sure that you fill in the information that you need. Also, after you finish these notes, there's a Google form that you will need to complete questions for. So, here we go. Before we really get into the revolution part of these notes, we need to talk a little bit about French society. And leading up to the French Revolution, French society was a very structured class society. Orders of French society that determined a person's legal rights and status were known as estates. And there were really three estates that people could belong to. The first estate belonged to the higher and the lower Catholic clergy. Second estate was consumed by nobility, and the third estate were made up of peasants, artisans, and primarily a group known as the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is basically the middle class. You could probably make an argument that the king was above all these three estates. You could also make an argument that even the third estate, those people who were the lowest of society, were kind of beneath that to a certain degree. Okay, these estates, for the most part, had their own um, rules and regulations. For the most part, a lot of the power was held primarily in that first and second estate. The majority of the people who lived in France consumed the third estate. Okay, in France, we had a king. And we've got to talk a little bit about the line of the monarchy here. Um, France had had a series of kings known as King Louis. Uh, King Louis the 16th that you see here pictured, his father, grandfather, and great grandfather, all really were what I would call divine right monarchs. And really, even probably before Louis the 13th, they were probably all divine right monarchs. Louis the 16th faced a financial crisis when his government had accumulated serious debt from wars and the extravagant court of a place called of his father's Louis the 15th. We're going to talk a little bit about this extravagant court. We're going to talk about the castle or the Palace of Versailles here in a minute. But as a result of this crisis that was taking place, taxes were called upon, especially by members of the Third Estate, to kind of help pay for things. Obviously, the majority of the people didn't want to pay the taxes, and so members of the Third Estate helped to form what is known as the National Assembly when members were locked out of the Estate General. Okay, the Estate General was kind of the legislative body that, or if you want to call it the Parliament of France. Primarily, the power was in the hands of the Second Estate. Members of the Third Estate really didn't have much of a voice, so they kind of walked out. And they took what was known as a tennis court oath. When they walked out, they walked across to a tennis court, indoor tennis court that was in Paris, and gathered there. And at that point in time, they decided to form their own um, legislative body that would become known as the National Assembly. This National Assembly, to me, kind of reminds me a lot of like the House of Representatives here in the United States. Okay, so they're mad. Okay, what are they really kind of upset about, especially when we talk about this extravagant court? It's this the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles didn't really originate as a palace. Versailles, if you go back to Louis the 13th, was actually a very small hunting lodge. Louis the 14th expanded it, and he built this very grand estate that you can kind of see here. You have the Hall of Mirrors, you have the Versailles Orangery, which is basically a very, very lovely garden with citrus and such. And then you have the palace itself, a very grand and over the top estate. Who pays for it? The third estate. And this is what they were upset about. They were being taxed, didn't have a lot of say, and it seemed like, it didn't matter if it was King Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th, or Louis the 16th. It seemed like these guys were always asking for money. And that certainly didn't set well with the people. Okay, so they rose up and they stormed what was known as this place called the Bastille. The Bastille fell when a mob seeking weapons to defend the National Assembly against attacks by the king. The Bastille itself was kind of like an armory, like our National Guard has an armory where they store their weaponry. It was also a prison and kind of a real, kind of, scary looking facility. Okay, the storming of this Bastille really marks the beginning of independence in France. And matter of fact, July 14th, 1789, which is known as Bastille Day, is basically the equivalent of Independence Day in France. So, in the summer of 1789, we had what was known as the Great Fear that was sweeping the nation. Fearful nobles in the National Assembly were forced to pass many reforms. The National Assembly also composed what was known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which stated a lot of the major principles that the reformers wanted. This decree, in a sense, is kind of a play off of our United States Declaration of Independence, maybe including some of those same kind of ideals for government within that document. So, King Louis XVI refused to accept either the reforms or the document, both of which weakened his power. And so in October of 1789, an angry mob marched on Versailles, forcing the king and his family to return to the city of Paris. Okay, while in Paris, for the most part, they were kind of hauled up in an apartment. Well, not really a low-class apartment, a really nice apartment. But nevertheless, concerned that the country of Austria might try to reinstate Louis XVI because Marie Antoinette, who was Louis's spouse, was from Austria. Leaders of the French Revolution declared war on this country in 1792. The mob that marched on Versailles, just so you know, was actually a group of women who went there and for the most part were very angry with some of the things that were happening. So we will talk next about Section 2. Please make sure that you take a look at the TED Ed video and complete the questions on your Google Forms.